A flight attendant swung a shattered bottle at a black teen in first class. Seconds later, his father flashed a federal badge and the cabin turned into a crime scene. What happens next will leave you speechless. He turned a bottle into a weapon against a child, sure his uniform would shield him. Subscribe if you believe no one is above the law. The plane was just beginning to taxi when Langston Ward stepped into the narrow aisle, his infant son Cairo nestled against his chest in a soft carrier. The hum of the engines vibrated underfoot, the scent of recirculated air and plastic trays hanging faintly in the atmosphere. Passengers had already settled into their seats, flipping through safety pamphlets or adjusting carry-ons. Langston moved carefully, scanning for his assigned row near the middle of the aircraft. His hand cradled the back of Cairo's fragile head, the baby's breath soft against his neck. As he stepped past row 12, a tall flight attendant emerged from the galley. Darren Vell. The man's posture was stiff, almost rigid, his eyes sharp beneath tightly groomed eyebrows. Their gazes met for half a second, just long enough for something cold to settle in Langston's stomach. Darren's stare was not just curiosity, it was appraising, skeptical, edged with something darker. His lips thinned, nostrils flaring slightly as if reacting to an invisible stench. Langston said nothing, kept walking, but the moment clung like static. Row 16. Langston shifted Cairo with practiced ease and gently lowered into his seat by the window. The infant stirred but didn't wake. Outside, the tarmac glinted in the morning sun. A baggage cart rattled by. The captain's voice broke through the overhead speakers, cheerful but rehearsed. "Welcome aboard Maryline Flight 228 to Ridgeport. Flight time approximately 2 hours. Please remain seated as we begin our taxi to the runway." Langston retrieved the infant harness from his diaper bag and buckled Cairo into the seat beside him. The harness clicked into place as he adjusted it with care, then tucked a soft blue blanket around the baby's legs. Cairo sighed in his sleep, mouth parting slightly. Langston exhaled, allowed himself a brief smile. Despite Cairo's teething phase, it had been a quiet morning. He was looking forward to the keynote in Ridgeport, a prestigious opportunity to unveil his latest architectural project, an urban development plan for waterfront housing. But mostly, he was eager to return home before nightfall, to be back in Venshaw before Cairo's bedtime. He was sealing the side of the baby's bottle when Darren passed by again. The attendant moved briskly, pushing the cart down the aisle, but slowed ever so slightly as he neared Langston's row. Another glance. Longer this time. Langston felt it scrape against his skin like a blade just beneath the surface. He looked up, meeting Darren's gaze again. "Everything all right?" Langston asked, tone even but cautious. Darren didn't respond immediately. He blinked, then forced a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Just making sure everyone's in compliance," he said flatly before pushing the cart onward. Langston watched him go, a flicker of unease tightening in his chest. The way Darren had scanned him, it wasn't about safety or routine. It felt like a test he hadn't realized he was taking. Still, he resisted the urge to dwell on it. He reached over, gently stroked Cairo's cheek. The baby shifted slightly and remained asleep. He adjusted the window shade and leaned back, trying to shake the feeling that had begun to gnaw at the back of his mind. The taxiing continued. A slight bump jolted the cabin as the aircraft turned toward the runway. The seatbelt signs chimed overhead. Darren reappeared once more, this time performing his safety check. His eyes darted methodically from seat to seat, but again they lingered when he reached Langston. The pause was brief, but unmistakable. Langston kept his voice calm. "We're strapped in. The infant harness is secure. You're welcome to double-check." Darren's jaw tensed. He gave a curt nod but said nothing, scribbled something on a small notepad tucked into his shirt pocket, then moved on without another word. Langston turned his head toward the window, jaw tightening. He could feel the subtle shift in atmosphere, not just around him, but in Darren's movements. There was a precision in the way the man walked, as though he were counting steps, waiting for an excuse to act. Langston knew that kind of energy. He'd seen it before in boardrooms where expectations were cloaked in politeness but backed by unspoken judgments. But this was different. There was no suit-and-tie veneer here, just a corridor 30,000 feet above the ground where decorum could snap at any second. Cairo stirred, his little fists stretching upward before he relaxed again. Langston brushed his thumb across the baby's knuckles. "We're okay," he whispered. But even as he said it, he didn't fully believe it. Overhead, bins rattled as the plane picked up speed. The engines roared. Takeoff. Langston's mind drifted, not to Ridgeport or the conference waiting for him, but to the feeling that had latched onto him the moment he boarded. The look, the silence, the restraint. There was no confrontation, no shouting, but there didn't need to be. The storm didn't have to arrive all at once. Sometimes it gathered in glances. He shifted in his seat, eyes fixed on the forward galley where Darren had disappeared. A flicker of movement caught his attention, the edge of a uniform sleeve. Then it vanished again. Langston exhaled slowly, glanced at Cairo, then leaned his head against the seat. It was supposed to be a smooth flight. Darren's cart rattled slightly as it moved along the narrow aisle, its wheels thudding softly against the uneven plain flooring. He paused at row 8, offered a soda and crackers to an older man with silver hair, smiled tightly, then moved on. At row 9, he nodded curtly to a pair of businessmen in suits and poured them glasses of orange juice with mechanical efficiency. But when he reached row 10, Langston's row, he didn't stop. The cart glided past like the row didn't exist. Langston lifted his hand subtly, not waving, just a gentle gesture to get attention. "Excuse me," he said with quiet politeness. "Could I please get a bottle of water?" Darren didn't even look at him. His voice came flat, indifferent. "We'll get to you when we can." He kept walking. Langston's jaw tensed, his eyes narrowing just slightly. He glanced around. A few passengers had noticed the exchange. A teenage boy 2 rows behind nudged his younger brother and raised his phone, recording a brief clip while whispering, "That was weird." But no one said anything aloud. No one wanted to get involved. Langston exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. Cairo shifted in his seat, making a soft, questioning sound. Langston leaned over, retrieving a small bottle from the diaper bag at his feet, and began gently feeding his son. Cairo latched on easily, soothed for the moment. The rhythmic sound of the plane's engines filled the silence, along with faint murmurs from passengers and the clinking of trays and cups. But beneath the calm, something simmered. Langston stared ahead, his mind ticking. He had flown dozens of times with Cairo, dealt with all types of staff, warm, indifferent, even annoyed, but never hostile. This wasn't oversight. This was deliberate. His thoughts were interrupted when Cairo's peaceful sucking faltered. The baby's brow furrowed, and a tiny, frustrated whine escaped his lips. Langston tried to readjust the bottle angle, but Cairo turned his head, the sound growing louder, a rising cry that pierced the cabin's dull murmur. Langston immediately shifted into parent mode, rocking Cairo gently, whispering, "It's okay, buddy. We're almost there. Just rest." He rubbed the child's back, his motions calm but urgent. The crying continued, escalating in waves. A few heads turned, some passengers looking with vague sympathy, others with the exhausted indifference of seasoned travelers. Cairo squirmed in his harness, his cheeks flushed. The sudden discomfort seemed to come from nowhere, but Langston knew babies sensed energy, tension, and the air had changed. That's when Darren returned. He was walking briskly down the aisle with empty hands, no cart this time. His expression was set like stone. As he reached Langston's row, he stopped and stared down at them. The pause stretched, too long, too loaded. Then he leaned in slightly, his words barely above a whisper but sharp as glass. "You need to keep him quiet," he muttered. "This isn't a daycare." Langston looked up, the calm in his face strained but present. "He's a baby," he said, keeping his voice even. "He's allowed to cry." There was no anger in his tone, only conviction. He had nothing to prove, but the way Darren's eyes flared at the words told him that wasn't enough. A ripple passed through the surrounding rows. A man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. A boy near the front paused his video game. The quiet confrontation seemed to tighten the air. Darren's mouth twisted into a slight sneer, the kind that wasn't about noise, but something deeper, older. He lingered just a second too long, then straightened and turned abruptly, disappearing into the galley with stiff shoulders. Langston watched him go, his heart pounding now, not from fear, but from something colder. A warning bell rang softly in the back of his mind. Not panic, not paranoia, just instinct. Years of reading people, of navigating professional spaces where being calm wasn't a choice, it was a skill for survival, had trained him to sense when something was turning. He looked down at Cairo, whose cries were softening now into hiccups and shallow breaths. Langston wiped a tear from the baby's cheek with the sleeve of his sweater, then tucked the blanket a little tighter around him. All around, the cabin slowly returned to motion. Drinks were poured, pages turned, screens flickered back to life. But Langston's body remained tense, unmoving, like a taut wire ready to snap. Something was building. The tray struck the edge of the armrest with a loud clack, jostling violently as the turbulence rumbled through the fuselage. The glass bottle of sparkling water, tall and heavy, spun toward the edge of Langston Ward's tray table, then dropped. It struck the carpeted floor with a sharp crack, shattering into jagged shards. The crash echoed down the aisle, piercing the uneasy hush that had settled after the jolt. Cairo, startled by the sound, let out a shrill wail, his tiny hands twitching against the restraints of his infant harness. Gasps fluttered from nearby seats. A businessman across the aisle blinked in alarm, lowering his newspaper. A middle-aged man behind Langston leaned forward, eyes darting between the broken glass and the flight attendant now standing above them. "Careful," Darren Vell said in a low, cutting voice, his breath just audible above Cairo's growing cries. "We don't want accidents, do we?" Langston turned his head slowly, locking eyes with the man. Darren's expression was unreadable, calm in a way that didn't feel calm at all. His lips were pulled into a tight line that barely passed for a smirk. Langston's heart thudded as his protective instincts roared beneath his stillness. He tugged Cairo closer, whispering softly, "It's okay. Daddy's here," trying to soothe the child even as a storm gathered in his chest. He looked down at the broken bottle, its glinting fragments scattered at his feet like teeth. No apology, no offer to help, just that cold, deliberate statement. "Is there a problem?" Langston asked quietly, his voice level but edged with disbelief. Darren didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head as if considering something. Then, in a motion far too casual for the setting, he reached back into the service cart and grabbed another unopened glass bottle, still cold, condensation trailing down its side like sweat on steel. Langston's breath caught. "Hey," he started, instinct rising to intercept whatever was about to happen. But Darren had already stepped forward. With unsettling ease, he leaned in once more, eyes fixed on the crying infant. The air between them thickened with dread. A few rows back, a teenage boy raised his phone, beginning to record again, his voice a whisper. "Dude, he's doing it again." Darren's grip tightened around the bottle. Langston rose slightly in his seat, one hand protectively over Cairo, the other bracing the back of the seat in front of him. His voice dropped. "Don't." For a moment, Darren froze. The cabin rattled again with another mild tremor, and the overhead bins creaked. Everyone was watching now, but still no one moved. The tension felt like a held breath, a thin line between restraint and violence. "Your child's crying is disturbing the cabin," Darren said flatly, his tone coated in artificial professionalism. "It's my duty to maintain a peaceful environment." "He's a baby," Langston replied, his voice sharper now, rising above the low thrum of the engines. "You slammed a bottle onto my tray and shattered it in front of him. Now you're, threatening us with another?" Passengers murmured. A man in a window seat 2 rows down began to stand, hesitating, then sat back down, unsure. The tension had paralyzed everyone. This wasn't just rudeness anymore. It was something else, something darker. "I'm going to have to ask you to calm your child," Darren continued, ignoring Langston's words completely. His grip didn't loosen. His other hand twitched slightly at his side. His knuckles were pale. Langston's eyes dropped for a split second to the bottle, its weight, its trajectory, its danger. Then back to Darren's face. He saw no empathy there, no uncertainty, just cold resolve. "He's afraid," Langston said, "just like everyone else right now. But you're not here to help. You're here to make a point." Darren's nostrils flared. Cairo's cry reached a pitch that cracked something inside Langston's chest. He knew that sound. It wasn't just discomfort. It was pain, raw and piercing, the kind of cry a father never forgets. And then it happened. Darren shifted the bottle, adjusting his grip with subtle menace. His other hand lifted slightly, hovering in the air as if ready to grab. Langston tensed, his own body angled to shield his son, his muscles coiled for any sign of movement. The bottle trembled in Darren's hand. Langston's thoughts swirled, flashbacks of Cairo's birth, his first giggle, those nights pacing the living room floor while humming lullabies into the dark. Every instinct screamed at him to end this before something shattered again. But he was still too late. Before Langston could process what was happening, Darren reached down, grabbed a second unopened glass bottle from his service cart and, with horrifying force, smashed it across the side of Cairo's tiny face. The sound of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot in the pressurized cabin. A sickening crunch followed. Cairo's head jerked violently to the side, his cheekbone taking the full impact. The glass bottle shattered on contact, sending jagged shards flying in all directions. Crimson bloomed instantly across the infant's delicate skin, the cut running from his temple down to the corner of his mouth. A high-pitched scream tore from his throat, raw and panicked, piercing the stunned silence that followed the blow. Langston's body froze, locked in the horror of the moment. His mind couldn't comprehend what had just happened. His son, his baby, had just been struck with a bottle. Cairo's tiny hands flailed helplessly, his eyes wide with terror, tears streaking down his blood-stained cheeks. Screams erupted around the cabin. A woman shouted, "Oh my God!" from across the aisle, her hand flying to her mouth. A male passenger leapt from his seat, charging forward instinctively, but Darren stepped back quickly, still clutching the thick glass neck of the broken bottle. His chest heaved, his pupils dilated. There was no trace of regret in his expression, only a twisted satisfaction, as if he'd just corrected a nuisance. "Back off," Darren barked at the approaching man, his voice trembling with adrenaline but steady enough to command space. Langston dropped to his knees beside Cairo, gathering his child into his arms as gently as he could, though the boy writhed in agony. Blood soaked through Langston's shirt within seconds. Cairo's screams had shifted to shallow gasps, his breathing jagged and labored. The sight of his baby's mangled face seared into Langston's soul. The flesh was torn open. Swelling had already begun. Bone glinted through a split in the skin near his jaw. "You broke him," Langston whispered, voice cracking as he stared into the trembling face of his son. His vision blurred with tears, but his focus remained unshaken. His hands trembled, part from fear, part from the storm swelling inside him. Darren didn't move. "Should have kept him quiet," he muttered, loud enough for Langston to hear. He said it with a sneer, the words dripping with contempt, as if violence against a child was an acceptable response to crying. Something inside Langston fractured, something deeper than grief or rage. It was a rupture of restraint, of belief that civility would protect him or his child. Time no longer moved at the same pace. Sounds faded to a dull murmur. The only clarity was the warm weight of Cairo in his arms, the way the baby's sobs began to weaken, the soft gurgling that followed. Langston's breath hitched. He laid Cairo back onto the seat, wrapping the blanket beneath his head to keep him upright. Blood dripped onto the cushion, soaking slowly into the fabric. Langston kissed his son's forehead, the touch feather-light, and whispered something only the child could hear, something that trembled with love and sorrow. Then Langston stood. There was no rush in his movements, no wild gestures. He rose slowly, his spine straightening like iron forged under pressure, his gaze fixed on Darren with the intensity of a flame held under glass. The cabin around them remained in stunned suspension. Some passengers sobbed quietly. Others covered their mouths, unable to speak. Langston's hand reached toward the tray where the shattered remains of the first bottle lay scattered. His fingers closed around one of the larger fragments, a curved piece, thick and sharp along the edges. The glass caught the overhead light and shimmered like a blade. Darren took a cautious step back. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "He's just a baby," Langston said, the words low and controlled. His voice was devoid of theatrics, stripped bare of anything but truth. The glass shard in his hand didn't shake. His posture didn't waver. The calmness in his tone was more terrifying than any scream. A few rows back, a passenger began recording with trembling hands. Another whispered, "Someone stop him!" But no one moved. They were witnessing something ancient, something primal. A father rising not with vengeance but with purpose. Langston stepped into the aisle. Each footfall sounded louder than the last against the muted carpet, echoing in the tense stillness. Darren's lips parted. He looked around as if expecting help. None came. His mouth twitched. "You're going to jail for this," he said, though the conviction in his voice was fading. Langston didn't respond. He lunged forward, not with fury, but with precision. The shard sliced through the air like a silent scream. The motion was fluid, efficient. The edge of the glass met Darren's neck in one clean drag, just beneath the jawline. A thin, red line formed instantly, as if someone had drawn it with a razor. For a heartbeat, Darren didn't react. He blinked. Then the wound split open. Blood spilled in a sudden rush, dark and fast. Darren clutched at his throat, gasping, stumbling backward. His knees buckled and he collapsed in the aisle, his legs twitching as life drained from his body. The broken shards slipped from Langston's hand and clattered to the floor, smearing red across the carpet. Gasps turned to screams. A man shouted for help. Somewhere near the rear, a call button was slammed repeatedly. Others rushed to pull children away, their faces pale and stunned. Langston stood in the aisle, his hands dripping, chest rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. The noise around him returned in a wave, crying, shouting, the panic of an airborne crowd. But Langston heard none of it. His eyes drifted back to Cairo. The baby's chest still moved. That was all that mattered. Langston lowered himself into the seat beside his son, pressing the warm blanket closer around the small frame. Cairo whimpered softly. Langston stroked his hair, eyes fixed on him with quiet reverence, as if the cabin around them didn't exist. Behind them, the body lay still. Around them, the world had lost its order. Langston whispered, almost inaudibly, "You don't get to walk away from this." Langston didn't hesitate. His hand moved on its own, fingers curling around a jagged shard of the broken glass bottle, its edges slick with condensation and glittering under the cabin lights. The air felt impossibly still, as though the entire plane had paused to witness what was about to unfold. Around him, passengers sat frozen, mothers with mouths half open, businessmen gripping armrests, teenagers clutching phones mid-record. No one moved, no one breathed. Time collapsed into a single, sharp moment. He rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the aisle. The piece of glass trembled slightly in his grip, not from fear, but from the fury simmering just beneath the surface. His eyes locked onto Darren's. "He's just a baby," Langston said, his voice low and hollow, almost ghost-like. There was no tremor in his tone, only a chilling finality. Darren's smirk faltered. He took a half-step back, uncertainty creeping into his once confident posture. His eyes darted around the cabin, searching for control, for authority, for the power he had just minutes ago when he stood over a crying child with disdain. But it was gone now, replaced by something far more terrifying, an unshakable father whose child had just been broken in front of him. Langston advanced, not fast, not wild, but with a terrifying steadiness that made Darren stumble back. The aisle was narrow, the walls of the plane suddenly tighter than ever, and Darren's retreat ended with a bump against the service cart. Langston didn't break pace. With one swift motion he lunged. The glass found its mark with horrifying precision. Langston dragged the shard across Darren's neck with clean, practiced motion, not as a man losing control, but as one reclaiming it. The line of red that followed was so thin at first it almost didn't register. Then it bloomed. Darren's mouth opened in stunned silence, his hand flying to his throat. The silence of disbelief gave way to chaos. Passengers screamed. The man in the window seat leapt into the aisle. A father across the cabin shielded his young son with both arms. Some ducked, others scrambled. But Langston stood in place, the bloody glass slipping from his fingers and landing on the floor with a soft clink. Darren staggered, hands soaked crimson, his breaths wet and sharp. He fell sideways against the service cart, then crumpled fully onto the carpeted floor of the aisle. His legs twitched. His eyes, once sharp with condescension, now stared at nothing. Langston didn't move. His chest heaved, not from effort, but from the sheer gravity of what had just occurred. His shirt was stained, not with his own blood, but with Cairo's. His hands trembled now, not from fear, but from what came after. He turned slowly, gaze sweeping over the stunned cabin. Every passenger looked back at him, some in horror, others in silent understanding. From the corner of his eye, Langston saw Cairo still lying in the seat, a flight blanket carefully folded beneath him. The baby's face was pale, his breathing shallow. Blood stained the side of his face where the bottle had struck. His tiny mouth twitched as if trying to cry again, but no sound came. A wet gurgle, then silence. The kind of silence that pierced deeper than any scream. Langston's legs nearly gave out. He stumbled toward his son, dropping to his knees beside him. He reached out but stopped short of touching the wound, afraid he might cause more harm. His fingertips hovered over Cairo's cheek, shaking now, trembling with helplessness. "You broke him," Langston whispered. His voice cracked, the words splintering in the air like the bottle had splintered moments before. There was no rage now, just grief. Raw, silent grief. Behind him, Darren's body lay still, the crimson spreading across the aisle carpet like ink in water. A few passengers cried softly. One man near the exit pressed the call button with shaking hands. Another recorded the scene, his phone trembling in his grip. But no one came forward. No one touched Langston. The man they had just watched explode was now motionless, broken by the weight of what had been taken from him. Darren's last words still echoed in Langston's mind, unshakable, vile. Should have kept him quiet. And that was it. That was the line. That was the moment the world had split into before and after. Langston leaned in, kissing Cairo's forehead gently, like a prayer. The boy didn't stir. Langston's breath hitched. Then, as if waking from a trance, he stood, slow, deliberate, purposeful. His bloodied hands fell to his sides. He turned to face the cabin again. The panic was still unfolding. Voices rose. A few passengers pressed themselves against the windows, desperate to distance themselves from the violence. But no one moved to stop him. Langston looked down at the broken glass still resting on the tray table. The same weapon he'd used to deliver justice. It caught the light again, only now it was no longer a shard. It was a mirror, reflecting the shattered image of a father who had done the unthinkable. Justice had never been so sudden. The sharp scream of a baby cut through the stunned silence like shattered glass, followed instantly by the rush of footsteps, gasps, and chaos. Blood poured from Cairo's cheek, staining the infant's clothes in deep crimson as his tiny body trembled from shock. Langston stood over him, his own hands soaked in red, shards of broken glass clinging to his sleeves like cruel reminders. The jagged bottle lay discarded on the aisle floor, its work done. Darren Vell's body twitched once, then went still, the gash across his throat blooming wider with every passing second. Before anyone could react further, a figure surged from the back of the cabin. He wore a plain gray sweatshirt, his eyes sharp and scanning, the kind of look that didn't belong to a vacationer. With a practiced motion, he drew his weapon low and to the side, not brandishing it, but ready. "Federal Air Marshal," he barked, his voice cutting through the din like a whip crack. "Everyone stay seated." The words brought momentary stillness. Some passengers ducked, others raised their hands. A few held their phones mid-air, recording. The marshal's name was Ren Gallo, and until moments ago he'd been pretending to nap 2 rows from the rear galley. His training taught him to recognize threats before they erupted, to move before others could react. But this? This had already happened. The violence was not brewing. It had boiled over. Langston slowly raised his arms, palms glistening with blood that wasn't his own. His chest heaved, but his voice came out clear and low. "My son," he said, nodding down toward the baby cradled in the seat beside him. "He shattered my son's face." Gallo's grip on his sidearm tightened slightly, but his eyes flicked down the row. He saw the infant, bleeding, motionless, his jaw grotesquely swollen. He saw the passengers, horrified, frozen, some crying. And he saw Langston, upright but visibly shaking, as if his mind hadn't caught up with what his body had done. From the opposite aisle, 2 men rose, their hands up to show they meant no harm. "We're doctors," one said. "We need to help the baby." "Go," Gallo instructed, nodding sharply. "You, move in slow." One of the men, a tall man in his early 50s wearing a brown suit with a subtle pinstripe, crouched carefully beside Cairo. "Russell Kane. I'm a pediatrician," he said quickly, pulling a small penlight from his inner pocket. His voice was steady, but his fingers moved fast, checking Cairo's breathing, examining the trauma along the child's jaw. "We need gauze, napkins, anything to stop this bleeding." A younger man in a blue sweater handed over a stack of paper towels from a flight attendant's station. Kane pressed them gently against the wound. Cairo whimpered, a soft, broken sound that drew a sharp breath from Langston. It was a sound of life, but only barely. Meanwhile, Gallo activated the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Cockpit, this is Marshal Gallo. We have a medical emergency and a hostile incident. 1 dead, 1 critical. Request immediate diversion. Closest airport with trauma care." The cockpit responded quickly. "Copy that, Marshal. We're diverting to Arledge International. 10 minutes to descent." Langston's arms dropped slowly, as if the weight of the moment finally sank into his bones. He didn't make a move toward Darren. He didn't speak again. He just stared at Cairo, at the blood now soaking through the child's clothes, at the flutter of those tiny eyelids. He hadn't meant to kill a man when he boarded this flight. He had only meant to keep his son safe. Gallo approached slowly, still cautious but no longer aiming his weapon. "Sir," he said carefully, "I need you to come with me to the rear. We're not going to hurt you, but I need to secure the cabin." Langston looked up. His expression was blank, but there was a storm behind his eyes. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Then, with a trembling hand, he brushed a curl from Cairo's forehead and whispered, "I'll be right back." Passengers cleared a path as Gallo led Langston to an empty row near the back, zip-tying his wrists loosely in front, blood still dripping from his fingers. The marshal didn't say much more. He didn't need to. The cabin had become something out of a nightmare, a baby's wail, a body on the floor, and the thick scent of blood lingering in recycled air. "Back near seat 11C, Doctor." Kane continued working, now assisted by one of the flight attendants who'd finally snapped out of his shock. "We're keeping him stable," Kane said over his shoulder, "but the moment we land, we need paramedics ready to go. This isn't something we can fix in the air." A sob broke out from the front of the plane. A teenager, one of the boys who had been filming earlier. He hadn't stopped recording. His voice was barely audible as he whispered to no one in particular. He did what any dad would have done. From the windows, the city below began to rise, runways growing larger as the plane dipped toward Arledge. The mood inside the cabin remained heavy, a collective breath held too long. In the rear, Langston sat motionless, wrists bound, his head bowed. His heart pounded not with fear of the law or guilt, but with one desperate, fragile hope that Cairo would survive this. The intercom chimed again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are on final approach. Emergency crews will meet us at the gate. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Langston didn't hear the rest. His eyes were fixed on the front of the plane, on the faint silhouette of a baby in a bassinet of bloody towels, on the tiny hand that had once gripped his finger with trust. And as the wheels screeched against the runway and the cabin jolted from sky to earth, he didn't think about the trial. He didn't think about the man he killed. He didn't care what happened next, only that Cairo was breathing. The wheels hit the tarmac hard. Tires screamed, engines roared in reverse thrust, and the entire cabin lurched forward with the jolt of an emergency landing. Oxygen masks swayed above stunned passengers. Langston didn't move. Blood stained the front of his shirt where he had cradled Cairo, now gone, rushed out by paramedics the moment the cabin door was torn open. Outside, floodlights from airport security trucks and ambulances pierced the night. Armed officers swarmed the plane like soldiers breaching a war zone. Langston stepped into the aisle, hands raised slowly, his fingers sticky with drying blood. The red and blue lights danced across his skin as rifles were trained on him. "Get on your knees," one of the officers barked. Langston obeyed without hesitation, eyes hollow. "Check the cameras," he said in a low, steady voice, "and someone save my boy." Two officers rushed forward, cuffing his wrists behind his back. He didn't resist. The chill of the metal against his skin barely registered. All he saw in his mind was Cairo, tiny, broken, crying until the silence swallowed his voice. Behind him, a stretcher bearing Darren Vell's lifeless body was wheeled down the air stairs. No one spoke. No one mourned. The crew stood frozen near the galley, wide-eyed and pale. A few passengers descended shakily, still holding phones with trembling hands, some replaying the footage over and over again as if to convince themselves it had truly happened. Langston was escorted down the steps. The tarmac was chaos, flashing lights, shouting voices, the thrum of urgency everywhere. A news van had already arrived, cameras trying to zoom through fences. Word had traveled fast. He was placed in the back of a cruiser, the doors locked without a word. The officer in the driver's seat didn't look at him. Just silence. At Arledge Police Station, Langston was led into a stark, fluorescent-lit interrogation room. The walls were a sterile off-white. A camera blinked red in the corner. He sat calmly, still cuffed as two detectives entered. Both men, both cautious yet visibly rattled. The older one, Detective Jaron Sloan, sat across from him with a legal pad. His partner, Officer Marcus Drex, leaned silently against the wall. "Tell us everything," Sloan said. Langston inhaled once, then began. No emotion, no embellishment, just a clear, detailed account, from the moment he boarded the plane to the final, irrevocable moment in the aisle. He described Darren's initial stare, the skipped service, the threats, and the glass bottle that shattered his son's face. He called him Noise, Langston said, his voice steady. A baby. My baby. Drex stepped forward, lowering his voice. You realize you took a man's life. Langston turned slowly to meet his eyes. And he nearly took my son's. Outside the room, the evidence was already spreading. The airline's internal surveillance footage had been pulled. Passengers had begun uploading videos, grainy clips of Darren's cold expression, the bottle's arc through the air, the moment Cairo screamed. One man's video captured Langston's voice shaking as he whispered to his son. Another caught the silence after the strike, and another, blurred but chilling, recorded the exact moment Langston retaliated. By midnight, the footage had gone viral. Major news outlets reported the mid-air assault with conflicting headlines. Some labeled Langston a hero. Others called him a vigilante. But the court of public opinion was rising. Back in the station, Langston remained still. He refused water. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He only asked once, softly, Is Cairo alive? Detective Sloan left the room to check. He returned 10 minutes later, slower, quieter. He made it to surgery, he said. Still in critical condition. They're doing everything they can. Langston closed his eyes, just once, then opened them again. Good. Outside, a group of bystanders had already begun gathering near the station gates, holding printed screenshots of the video. A father holding his own infant son in a carrier stood quietly near the crowd, saying nothing but watching everything. Inside, a junior officer read the social media threads out loud in disbelief. Hashtags like Hiko Protect Langston, Hika Justice for Cairo, and Ithaca Flight 741 incident were already trending. But none of that sped up the law. Langston was formally charged with manslaughter pending investigation. Despite the rising public outcry, the law required process. A bail hearing was scheduled for the next morning. The prosecution argued severity. The defense had yet to arrive. Langston sat alone in a temporary holding cell, staring at the tiled floor. The weight of everything began to settle. Cairo's blood, the sharp sting of shattered glass, the dead stare in Darren's eyes, and the sound of silence afterward. He was alone, but not broken. In a small room down the hall, an officer reviewed passenger testimonies and security footage again. One clip showed a teenager muttering, "That was weird," right before the bottle smashed. Another clip showed a pediatrician kneeling beside the baby, hands soaked in blood, pleading for bandages. Evidence was stacking quickly, but charges, the officer knew, rarely moved at the speed of morality. As dawn neared, a young lawyer named Malik Sayers arrived at the station, files in hand and eyes fierce with purpose. He would later tell a reporter, "I saw the footage once." That was enough. But Langston didn't know that yet. All he knew was that his son was fighting to live, and he had no regrets. In the eyes of the law, what's justified isn't always what's legal. He struck a black infant and thought silence would hide it. Witnesses and cabin cameras said otherwise. If you believe cruelty must face consequences, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Langston's wrists were still cold from the steel cuffs when the courtroom doors slammed shut behind him. The flashing of cameras and the murmurs of reporters echoed outside like a distant storm. But inside his mind, only Cairo's scream remained, looping endlessly, lodged deep behind his eyes. Blood had dried beneath his fingernails. His shirt still carried the weight of his son's pain, a crimson shadow that no one could ignore. When the judge read the charge, manslaughter pending investigation, Langston didn't flinch. His face was stone, his thoughts fixed on a single question. Is Cairo still breathing? The bail hearing came swiftly, the courtroom packed with spectators, journalists, and a few quiet supporters clutching signs of protest just outside the windows. A prosecutor in a gray suit tried to reduce the event to emotion, painting Langston as a man who had snapped. But the defense, a hastily assembled civil rights team led by Malik Sayers, stood tall, calm, and immovable. Malik was a man of measured words and relentless purpose. He had taken the case pro bono the moment the flight video surfaced online, clips of Darren's blow, the shattering bottle, Cairo's scream, and Langston's reaction. "This is not about vengeance," Malik declared before the judge, his voice steady. "It is about protection. It is about a father forced into a moment no parent should ever face." The judge studied the footage in silence. Langston didn't speak once. His eyes never moved from the screen as it replayed the horror. When bail was granted, set with strict house arrest and monitoring, there was no celebration. Langston simply nodded, whispered, "Thank you" to Malik, and requested one thing: take me to the hospital. The next hours blurred into corridors and antiseptic air. Venshaw Memorial's pediatric trauma unit was quiet except for the soft rhythm of machines. Cairo lay motionless under pale blue sheets, his tiny head swaddled in gauze, only the rise and fall of his chest confirming life. A small monitor beeped gently beside him. Titanium plates had been installed to repair the crushed segments of his jaw, and a drainage tube extended from the side of his neck. Doctors were cautious in their updates, truth layered in careful phrasing. "There's extensive damage to the lower mandible," one of the surgeons, Dr. Keene, explained, flipping through a scan. "We're concerned about the mandibular nerve. There may be long-term effects, speech delays, facial motor function. We won't know until he tries to speak again." Langston's chest tightened. He reached for Cairo's hand, brushing his thumb over the boy's fingers. They didn't move. "Is he in pain?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. Dr. Keene hesitated, then nodded slightly. "We're managing it. He's sedated most of the time." Langston sat down beside the bed and didn't move, not for minutes, not for hours. He watched Cairo's face, barely visible beneath the gauze and swelling. The machines blinked and hummed, indifferent to grief. The hospital chair was hard, the lighting cold, but Langston didn't care. His world had narrowed to the space between his fingers and his son's pulse. Malik visited that evening, placing files on the side table but keeping his tone gentle. "You're going to be hit from every direction, Langston," he said. "The media is already split. Some say you're a hero, others say you're dangerous. We have to stay focused. This isn't over." Langston nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Cairo. "I didn't go looking for a fight," he said, "but I won't apologize for stopping one." Outside, the news cycle devoured the footage like wildfire. Cable anchors debated the ethics of Langston's actions, while social media split into war zones. Hashtags like Yikadichuk Protect Cairo and Ititiju Father or Felon trended side by side. Protesters gathered outside Maroline Air's headquarters, their chants echoing against mirrored glass towers. But inside the hospital room, the noise never reached. Here, there was only stillness and the faint smell of antiseptic. Days passed in measured pain. Nurses rotated in and out. Cairo remained mostly sedated, waking only for brief, dazed moments. Langston read to him softly from a storybook he remembered from his own childhood. "The lion who lost his roar," he whispered one night, "but still guarded the forest." Cairo's hand twitched faintly. Langston froze. "Did you feel that?" he asked the nurse. She nodded. "He hears you," she said. Each day, Langston filled with equal parts hope and helplessness. He couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't erase the memory of Cairo's shriek or the sound of the bottle breaking. But he could be here. And so, he stayed, house arrest bracelet blinking silently on his ankle, ignored. Malik returned with updates. "The district attorney is under pressure. They wanted to deny bail, but public outcry forced their hand. They're hoping to bury the case in procedure. By time, you need to be ready." "I'm not leaving him," Langston said. "I wouldn't ask you to," Malik replied. At night, Langston stood by the hospital window, watching the city blur into orange light and fog. Sometimes he imagined Darren's expression, that last, hateful glance, then forced it away. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about survival, about justice, about healing the boy whose voice might never be the same. One night, Langston found a folded note beside Cairo's bed. A nurse had left it. The handwriting was careful, the message brief. "You did what any father would do. Stay strong." He folded it and placed it in his wallet. Langston counted each breath Cairo took as though it tethered him to sanity. He whispered the same promise every morning and every night. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Some days, Cairo's fingers tightened around his. Other days, there was only stillness. But Langston never gave up. The doctors warned again about long-term effects. "Speech," they said, "facial development, future surgeries." Langston only nodded, one step at a time. On the seventh night, a strange silence filled the room. Not from the machines, but from the weight of uncertainty finally collapsing into something deeper. Langston pressed his forehead to Cairo's, his voice breaking. "You didn't deserve this," he whispered, "but I swear I'll never let them forget what they did." He leaned back, stared at the ceiling, and took a breath that felt like stone. The silence between them hurt more than the screaming ever had. The footage had barely aired for 12 hours when the first wave of protests hit the front gates of Maroline Air's corporate headquarters. A raw wind swept through the concrete plaza, stirring banners and muffled voices into a rising tide of outrage. Outside the mirrored glass tower, a crowd had formed, fathers holding their children close, students with hand-painted signs, and workers in high-visibility vests who had taken off early to join the line. The footage of Darren Vell's final act, the bottle crashing into Cairo Ward's face, had ignited something deeper than a news cycle. It struck a nerve that had long been frayed. By noon, the chant had found its rhythm. Who let him fly? Who let him fly? Inside the building, tension simmered behind security doors and boardroom walls. Phones rang without pause. Legal advisors whispered to executives, PR teams scrambled to draft new statements, and HR directors reviewed records with trembling hands. But the damage was already done. A single man's cruelty had torn off the veil. The following morning, Malik Sayers stood behind a podium on the courthouse steps, the wind pressing against his tailored coat. Reporters packed the sidewalk, their cameras raised like rifles. Microphones leaned in from all angles. "I want to be clear," Malik said, voice steady, face impassive. "This is no longer about one father, one flight, or one attack. This is about an entire system that looked away, again and again, and let a man like Darren Vell keep flying. And when they did that, they gambled with lives. One of those lives was Cairo's." Behind him, Langston stood silent, his hands folded tightly, his eyes hollow. The crowd erupted in applause. Some cheered, others wept. But Malik had more than words. That afternoon, he released the first batch of internal documents obtained through a whistleblower inside Maroline's operations team. The man's name was Greg Truon, a quiet, wiry figure with sunken cheeks and a permanent squint, a ground crew manager who had worked at the airline for nearly 18 years. Greg didn't speak to the press. He didn't want the spotlight. But what he had was more valuable than 1,000 interviews. A string of emails, memos with red stamps, digital logs showing employee transfers. One folder, dated just 2 weeks before the flight, contained a written warning issued to Darren Vell for aggressive conduct toward a black father traveling with a toddler. The report stated that Darren had verbally threatened to shut that kid up and was overheard saying, "Some people shouldn't be allowed to fly." The supervisor had recommended termination. The response from HR, "Final warning, staffing remains tight, no immediate replacement available." Another document traced Darren's employment history. He had been transferred between 3 airlines over the last 10 years. Each time, complaints followed him, passenger statements, crew evaluations, and each time the airline quietly let him go, or, in Maroline's case, let him stay. "This wasn't negligence," Malik said in a follow-up interview. "It was convenience. They valued bodies and uniforms more than the people in the seats." Langston sat in his living room that evening, watching the coverage unfold. Cairo lay sleeping beside him on the couch, his face partially wrapped in soft bandages. The television flickered, showing drone footage of the growing crowd outside Maroline. Langston barely blinked. He remembered that first glare from Darren the moment he'd boarded. It hadn't been random. It had been practiced, habitual, a face used to getting away with things. Now, for the first time, the world was seeing it too. Malik called just past midnight. His voice was tight with energy. "They're panicking. Their lawyers tried to offer a quiet settlement, no admission of fault, just a payout." Langston didn't speak. "I told them no," Malik added. "We're not here for silence. We're here for sunlight." Langston finally said, "Then, keep the light on them." The next day, Greg agreed to testify. He met Malik in a small office at a legal nonprofit in Venshaw, clutching a folder like it might vanish. He sat down, avoided eye contact, and began to speak. "I tried," Greg said quietly. "I flagged Darren's record more than once, but they just pushed it aside. Always an excuse. Busy season, short staff. He'll get a warning." One time, someone in upper ops said, "He's only rough with certain passengers, don't make it a thing." I never forgot that. Certain passengers. Greg swallowed hard. And then I saw the video. I saw that baby's face. I couldn't live with it anymore." Malik nodded. "You did the right thing." "They won't say that," Greg muttered. "They'll ruin me." "We won't let them." By the end of the week, Malik had filed an official motion to introduce the whistleblower evidence into court proceedings. The prosecutor objected, arguing it was prejudicial. But the judge, after reviewing the documentation and impact relevance, ruled in Malik's favor. The evidence would be admitted. Outside, the protests swelled. By the following weekend, over 2,000 people lined the avenues around Merrowline's main terminal. Fathers marched with photographs of their children. Sons stood with signs reading, "Would you stay quiet?" A moment of silence was held for Cairo. Langston didn't attend. He stayed in the hospital, watching over his son as doctors adjusted the titanium support under his jaw. The machines beeped softly. Cairo's fingers wrapped around one of his. Langston whispered a promise that only they could hear. The next morning, Malik returned to the courthouse steps for a second press conference. This time, the atmosphere was electric. "We now know that Darren Vell was protected by his employer," Malik said, his voice louder than before. "We now know that Merrowline Air saw the danger and chose to gamble anyway. Their choice shattered a child's face. Their choice cost a man his life. If justice exists, it won't just clear Langston's name, it'll tear down the system that let Darren keep flying." The crowd roared. The case had become bigger than a single moment. It was about who gets protected and who gets punished. Langston sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched into fists on the table in front of him, staring ahead at the jury. The silence was deafening, thick with the weight of the decision that lay in their hands. The prosecution had just finished their opening argument, painting Langston as a man overcome by emotion, a father who let his grief and rage cloud his judgment, a man who had murdered in cold blood. They argued that while the act was understandable, it was still a killing, an action that could not be excused. "A man was dead," the prosecutor had said, "and no matter how you look at it, that man didn't deserve to die." The words stung Langston's ears, but he held his ground. He hadn't killed in cold blood. He had acted to protect his son. But that wasn't a story the jury had yet heard. That was the part the prosecution wanted to suppress, the truth of what happened before the violence erupted. And that was exactly why Malik Sayers, his lawyer, had worked tirelessly to prepare the counterattack. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Malik began, his voice clear and unwavering as he stood and addressed the court. "What happened in that airplane wasn't a simple act of vengeance. It wasn't an act of anger. It was a father protecting his child from an unimaginable assault." Langston's breath caught in his chest as Malik presented the first piece of evidence, a video recording from a passenger's phone. The footage showed the moment Darren Vell, the flight attendant, swung the bottle at Cairo's face. The sound of glass shattering and the blood pouring from the baby's face seemed to hang in the air, replaying in the minds of everyone present. The camera cut quickly to Langston's reaction, his sudden, terrifying movement toward Darren. The video stopped, and the room seemed to pulse with the intensity of the moment. Langston felt the weight of every eye in the room on him, but his thoughts drifted back to that instant, the instant when he saw his son's face shattered. He remembered Cairo's cries, the helplessness that tore through him like a physical force. He remembered how the world had gone silent in that instant, how nothing mattered except the fear and pain in his son's eyes. "I want you to see this," Malik's voice rang out, drawing Langston's attention back to the present. "Look at this moment. Look at what happened before my client took any action. This wasn't a man lashing out in a fit of rage. This was a father whose child had been brutally attacked." Dr. Kane, a pediatrician who had examined Cairo after the incident, was called to the stand. The tension in the room thickened as the doctor began recounting the damage Cairo had suffered, how the glass had sliced through his delicate skin, how his jaw had been fractured, how the child's life had hung in the balance for days after the attack. Every word Dr. Kane spoke was a reminder of the horrors Langston had witnessed, the horrors that no father should ever have to endure. Multiple passengers testified, each of them describing the hostility they had seen in Darren before the incident. "He was rude," one man said. "He seemed like he was looking for a reason to cause trouble." Another passenger, a woman seated 2 rows behind Langston, recalled hearing Darren's harsh words to Langston when Cairo's cries filled the cabin. "It wasn't just the bottle," she said, her voice shaking. "It was his whole attitude. It was like he didn't see Langston as a person, just a target." The prosecutor objected, but Malik pushed forward, calling up one last piece of evidence, the critical moment when Langston, after witnessing the assault, reacted with cold precision. "You'll see that it was not an impulse, not a snap decision," Malik said. "This was a measured response, an act of survival. This was a father who refused to let his son be destroyed." The video resumed, showing Langston's hands gripping the broken bottle, his eyes hardening with purpose as he advanced toward Darren. The scene played out in stark detail. Langston's deliberate actions, the sound of glass slicing through the air, and Darren collapsing to the floor, clutching his neck. The courtroom was silent. A juror wiped a tear from his eye. Even the judge, a man who had seen countless cases of violence, looked shaken. Malik's voice broke the stillness. "There are moments," he said, pausing to let the words sink in, "when the law asks a father to do nothing while his child is destroyed. This wasn't one of those moments." Greg Truon walked slowly to the witness stand, every eye in the courtroom fixed on him. He was tall, unshaven, and wore a navy blue maintenance uniform that looked a size too big, its stitched name tag slightly frayed, but there was nothing unsure in his step. He sat, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at the jury. "I was the ground crew manager at Merrillines Arledge Division," Greg began, his voice calm but edged with tension, "and I've kept my mouth shut long enough." Langston sat upright at the defense table, fists clenched on his knees. His heart thudded louder than he wanted it to, but his eyes remained steady. He had seen this man once before, months ago on the runway, clipboard in hand, waving crew into place like a conductor guiding a silent orchestra. Now, that same man might shift the entire case. Greg's testimony started simple: routine schedules, policy standards, nothing that raised alarms. But then he opened a thick manila envelope and withdrew several printed memos. The courtroom rustled as he held them up. "This," Greg said, holding one page between his fingers, "is the internal notice issued 3 days before the flight. It confirms that Darren Vell was on probation after a formal complaint from a black passenger who claimed verbal threats were made toward him and his child. You'll see it says, and I quote, 'Final written warning issued. No further infractions tolerated.'" The prosecution objected, but the judge leaned forward, already reading the printed text projected onto the court monitors. "Objection overruled. Continue, Mr. Truon." Langston didn't breathe. Greg turned to the second document. "This is the flight crew schedule for the day of Langston Ward's flight. Darren wasn't originally assigned to it. Another attendant, Marcus Lyle, called out sick. A last-minute change was made, and Darren was pulled from standby. I flagged the decision. I said it was risky, especially with Darren's warning still active. My concern was dismissed." A ripple moved through the gallery. Reporters scribbled, fingers flew across phone screens. But Greg wasn't finished. "They gambled with lives that day," he said, his voice tightening, "and Cairo paid the price." Silence gripped the courtroom. Langston lowered his eyes, the memory of that moment replaying behind his lids. The bottle, the scream, the blood. His son's scream still echoed inside him like a fire alarm that would never shut off. Malik Sayers rose from his chair. "Mr. Truon, why didn't you come forward sooner?" Greg exhaled. "Because I thought the system would handle it. Because I was scared of losing my job. But when I saw the footage, when I saw that baby—" His voice cracked. "I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Malik nodded once and returned to his seat. The judge allowed the documents into evidence. A sense of gravity settled across the courtroom like fog. Jurors exchanged glances, some troubled, some stunned. The prosecution attempted to discredit Greg, asking about his own reprimands and chain of command, but the damage had been done. The truth had been spoken in black ink and quiet courage. Then came the second shock. The side door of the courtroom opened gently, and a nurse stepped in, wheeling a small hospital chair forward. A tiny figure sat in it, fragile, his head wrapped in soft white gauze, a plastic brace holding his jaw in place. Cairo. Gasps escaped from several spectators. Even the judge momentarily looked away, blinking twice. Langston's eyes locked on his son's. Everything else disappeared, the lawyers, the walls, the cameras. All he saw was the soft glisten in Cairo's eyes and the tremble in his small fingers. The nurse pushed the chair gently until Cairo was near the witness box. No words were spoken. It wasn't testimony. It was a moment. Langston rose slowly, knees shaking, and took one step forward. The guards didn't stop him. No one did. His hands trembled, heart pounding in his chest like war drums. Cairo lifted his hand. A small gesture, a tiny arm, rising through pain and healing, fingers reaching toward his father like a signal flare. Langston didn't speak. He didn't have to. His tears did all the talking. He pressed a hand to his chest, lips parted but soundless. The jury stared. One older man among them wiped his eyes. A younger juror covered her mouth. No one moved. The prosecution didn't dare object. The nurse gently turned Cairo's chair to the side again and slowly wheeled him back through the courtroom doors. But the moment stayed. Langston lowered himself back into his seat, hands covering his face, his shoulders trembling. Beside him, Malik leaned close, whispering something, but Langston didn't hear. He was still locked in that brief second, Cairo's eyes meeting his, forgiveness and strength pouring from a child who had already endured more than most men ever would. Up in the gallery, one of the reporters typed quietly. A headline already forming. The father, the flight, the finger raised. But it wasn't just that gesture. It was what it meant, because in that instant, the entire courtroom saw what the law often forgets. This wasn't about revenge, it was about protection. And from that point forward, the trial would never be the same. That one moment changed the tone of the entire trial. The prosecutor stepped forward, voice clipped and deliberate, the kind that tried to sound neutral but carried a blade just beneath the surface. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing slowly before the bench, "this is not a case of racial profiling. This is not even a case about a crying child. This is a case of vigilante justice, raw, emotional, and dangerous." Langston sat motionless beside his attorney, Malik Sayers, eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the courtroom wall. The room was packed, reporters, supporters, even off-duty officers filling the pews, all waiting to see how justice would weigh the cost of a father's fury. The prosecutor turned toward the jury, raising a finger for emphasis. "We do not get to decide life and death in the heat of grief. If we permit this act, if we justify it, what message do we send? That emotion gives us the right to kill?" He paused, letting the silence settle like dust in the air. That is not the law. That is not justice. That is chaos disguised as compassion. Langston felt his throat tighten, not with fear, but restraint. He hadn't said much during the trial, only when needed, but his silence wasn't weakness. It was purpose. He wanted the truth to speak louder than anything he could say. The prosecutor nodded once and stepped back. "Thank you." Then Malik stood. The courtroom shifted. It wasn't a roar, it was a hum, a silent anticipation that something honest was about to be spoken. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He walked to the center of the courtroom and simply looked at the jury. "He didn't draw a weapon," he said, voice low but resolute. "He didn't premeditate. He didn't come looking for violence. He came with his son. He came as a father." Malik paused and slowly turned to Langston, then back to the jury. He reacted to an act so cruel, so inhuman, that no father would stand idly by. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man with creases of sorrow on his brow, shifted in his seat. Another, a younger man with trembling hands, pressed his lips together tightly. "The real question here," Malik continued, his voice tightening with passion, "is not whether he killed a man. It's whether he had a choice." A quiet wind seemed to pass through the room. Malik walked slowly back to the defense table, his hand briefly resting on Langston's shoulder before sitting down. Langston didn't flinch, but in his chest, his heart pounded like a war drum, slow and deep. The judge instructed the jury, and they were dismissed for deliberation. Hours turned to one day, then another. Every minute inside that courthouse felt like a year peeling away from Langston's soul. Outside, protesters rallied. Inside, silence reigned. When the jury returned, the room fell into a hush so complete that even the scratch of the bailiff's pen was deafening. The foreman, a quiet man with steel-gray hair and a rigid spine, stood, holding a paper that now held the weight of Langston's entire future. "On the charge of manslaughter," he began, "we find the defendant, Langston Ward." Langston's breath stopped. "Not guilty." A gasp broke across the gallery. Someone sobbed. The judge raised a hand for silence. "On the charge of unlawful use of a weapon," the foreman continued, "we find the defendant guilty." Langston lowered his gaze. "But recommend dismissal with time served, based on mitigating circumstances." The gavel struck once. The silence broke. The courtroom erupted, reporters darting up, supporters crying out in relief, hands rising, phones flashing. But Langston didn't hear any of it. His legs gave out beneath him, and he fell into Malik's arms, his frame trembling with the release of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. His son had survived. The truth had survived. Cameras zoomed in, microphones pushed forward, voices shouted questions. Langston stood again, tall, composed, every muscle worn thin by grief and waiting. He faced the press only briefly. "My son survived," he said quietly. "That's all that matters." Marrowline Air faced enormous backlash. The moment the jury returned its verdict and Langston Ward stepped out of that courthouse, the story shifted from a father's desperate act to a national reckoning. Within hours, stock analysts downgraded the airline. By nightfall, protesters circled the glass-paneled headquarters in Cipher City, holding up signs, chanting names, and projecting footage of the attack onto the side of the building. Boardroom lights flickered deep into the night. The corporate walls that once seemed so untouchable now trembled under the weight of consequence. Inside the executive suite on the 25th floor, CEO Franklin Roth stood in front of the window, arms folded, face blank as his legal advisor read out the latest media bulletin. "It's not just social media anymore," the man said, pacing. "CNN's on it, the FAA is demanding answers, and our own investors are jumping ship." Roth didn't respond. He stared at the distant skyline, then turned toward his desk and slowly removed his nameplate. By morning, he was gone. Langston read the headline, "Marrowline CEO resigns amid scandal," on the hospital lobby's television, the sound muted, the image of Roth walking briskly past reporters playing on a loop. But Langston didn't flinch. He sat quietly, arms resting on his knees, eyes focused on the door to the pediatric wing. A soft creak announced its opening, and Dr. Kane emerged, clipboard in hand. His face was calm but serious. "He's healing," the doctor said, nodding. "Speech development will need time. The therapy is working." Langston stood, his chest rising with a breath that trembled. "Can I see him?" Dr. Kane smiled faintly. "Of course." Inside the dim hospital room, sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, painting pale lines across the floor. Cairo lay in the small bed, a custom-fitted brace framing his tiny jaw and cheek. He was watching cartoons on a muted tablet, eyes half-lidded but bright. When Langston stepped in, Cairo turned his head, slowly, carefully, and gave a faint smile. Langston knelt beside the bed. "You're strong, you know that?" His voice broke slightly, but he kept the tears in check. "You're my whole world." Cairo reached a small hand toward him, fingers brushing against Langston's. That gesture, as soft as wind through leaves, felt heavier than any courtroom verdict. Though the cameras still chased him, Langston refused all media requests. The networks wanted interviews, exclusive sit-downs, emotional breakdowns in prime time. He declined every offer. Instead, he poured his attention into his son and something else, something that had been brewing inside him since the day he saw Cairo's blood on his hands. It started with a conversation in the hospital cafeteria. Malik Sayers had dropped by, still in a suit, legal pads under his arm. "You know," Malik said between sips of burnt coffee, "we could push this further. File civil charges, force deeper audits. You've got the public behind you now. You're not just a father, you're a symbol." Langston shook his head. "Symbols fade. I want something that stays." "What are you thinking?" Langston stared ahead, not at Malik, not at the hospital walls, but at the memory of Cairo's scream. "I want to make sure no other parent has to hear that sound." That night, the foundation was born. Quietly, without fanfare. Just a name scribbled in a notebook. Shards to Shields. A place where victims of in-flight or institutional assault could get legal aid, trauma therapy, and advocacy. A place where pain would not be archived but transformed. Langston stood silently before the plaque, the morning wind curling around his coat like a whisper from the past. The memorial was small, just a circular stone embedded in the concrete outside Terminal C of Arledge International Airport, but its impact was immense. Etched into its surface in bronze lettering were two names, Langston Ward and Cairo Ward. Beneath them, a single phrase gleamed under the soft light of the overcast sky. "He stood when others froze." Langston's jaw tightened as he read the words. He didn't need a plaque to remind him. The image of shattered glass, the scream, the blood, none of it had faded. Some memories don't soften with time. They sharpen. Beside him, Cairo clutched a small stuffed elephant in his left hand, the right one gripping his father's index finger tightly. A soft, metal brace still wrapped around the lower half of the boy's jaw, a faint reminder of what had been taken and what had been saved. He didn't speak often. Doctors said words would return eventually, but Langston wasn't in a rush. They had survived. That was enough for now. People passed, some casting lingering glances at them, others nodding in faint recognition. Langston didn't mind. He had grown used to the stares, the cautious admiration, the silent apologies from strangers who weren't there but felt the weight of what happened all the same. The trial had ended a year ago, but its tremors still rippled through airports, newsrooms, courtrooms. The man who struck back. That's what they'd called him. But Langston never cared for titles. His focus had always been singular. Cairo. A sharp voice cut through the hum of background noise. "Excuse me, sir," a man called. Langston turned. A young father approached, maybe mid-20s, wearing a charcoal coat and thick-framed glasses. In his arms, he cradled a baby girl wrapped in a lavender blanket, her eyes barely peeking above the fabric. "I just wanted to say—" The man's voice cracked slightly. "Because of you, I know what courage looks like." Langston met his gaze, surprised by the sincerity swimming behind the man's nervous smile. He wasn't looking for validation, but something in the man's voice, fragile, full, landed with quiet force. He nodded once, firmly. "Thank you," Langston replied, his voice even. "Take care of her." The man gave a slow nod, eyes misting. "I will," he whispered, then turned away, bouncing the baby gently as he disappeared into the airport crowd. Langston looked back at the plaque, his reflection faint in the polished bronze. It was strange how grief, anger, and justice had all twisted into something he hadn't expected. Peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but from surviving. Behind him, Cairo shifted his weight, tugging at his hand. Langston looked down. The boy's eyes were wide and curious, scanning the sky. He raised a hand slowly, the brace on his face making his movement slightly stiff. Then he pointed upward. Langston followed his finger. The clouds above were moving fast, rolling like waves in a muted ocean. Planes climbed steadily through the haze, leaving faint trails that thinned in the wind. "Up," Cairo whispered through his healing jaw, the word soft but clear. Langston's heart clenched. It wasn't just the word, it was the voice. Fragile, yes, but steady. Without hesitation, Langston bent down, lifting his son into his arms. Cairo rested his head against his shoulder, and they both stared at the sky. And they rose, not just above tragedy, but beyond it. Minutes later, he was grounded in handcuffs and his power was gone. If you stand for protecting the innocent and real accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It addresses themes of racism, abuse of authority, workplace violence, and accountability in positions of trust. Its purpose is to raise awareness about discrimination, provoke reflection on due process and passenger safety, and inspire empathy and action toward justice.